Sometimes even major security alliances lack a prepared plan. One of them is the moment when the main pressure doesn't come from outside, but from within the alliance itself. After the United States intervened militarily in Venezuela and detained its president, Bielendam confirmed that he is considering several options regarding Greenland, including the use of the military. Not as a political gesture, but as one of the official options that are on the table. This is precisely where NATO faces a question without a clear guide. Its mechanisms are set up to deal with crises that come from the outside. It's much less clear how they work when the decisive pressure comes from the most influential member. This video doesn't try to judge who's right and who's not. It focuses on the system, its boundaries, and what can happen when the rules collide with the reality of power. Why is this happening? We have it right now. If this were just an old idea that sometimes appeared in the media, Greenland wouldn't be today's main topic. Its strategic location has been discussed for decades, and the American presence on the island is nothing new. What has changed is not Greenland itself, but the context in which it is being discussed. After the United States intervened in Venezuela, where American forces directly detained the head of state and took him to the United States to face charges, the stakes have changed. The line between political pressure and direct action has moved. And right at this moment, Washington announced that all options are being considered regarding Greenland, including the use of the military. This is a turning point, not because a military operation is about to happen immediately, but because the framework of thinking has changed. Greenland is no longer just a hypothetical topic. It has become a practical issue. The island's strategic importance is no longer in question, but rather about how it could be acquired in a system that doesn't have clear rules for internal pressure. Greenland does not appear as a goal in itself in this context, but as a test case. Something that can be used to test how far a great power's possibilities reach within an alliance that is based on consensus, not on a balance of power. That's exactly why discussing scenarios makes sense. Not about one big step, but about several paths that look different, yet can lead to the same result. From quietly expanding influence to open, coercive solutions. Each scenario has its own dynamic, pace, and risk. They all share one thing. The alliance does not have a clear answer prepared for them. The first scenario? Silent expansion. When people mention acquiring Greenland, most picture the most extreme scenario. Military action, pressure, open conflict. That's why the first scenario is also the least conspicuous and the most likely. It doesn't start with an invasion or an ultimatum. It begins the moment after the events in Venezuela, when the boundary of what is considered politically and practically possible shifts. In the context of recent statements from Washington, the silent expansion takes on a completely different meaning. The United States has had a military presence in Greenland for decades. They operate a base there. They have established infrastructure, staff, logistics, and operational experience. It's not about entering the unknown, but about expanding reality. The initial steps wouldn't make headlines. It would involve modernizing facilities, expanding capacity, enhancing Arctic protection, or responding to new regional security conditions. Each step is justifiable and aligns with allied cooperation. Thank you for your attention. The turning point happens in practice, not just on paper. While the territory's legal status stays the same, decision-making power shifts. Security issues are gradually shifting toward Washington because it is the one that has the capacities, technologies, and personnel. Every temporary measure creates a new precedent, which will be followed by another. And when these steps are added up, the result no longer looks like cooperation between equal partners, but rather a shift in real control. This development is especially problematic for us because it doesn't break any clear rules. It's not an attack, it's not a conflict, it's not a violation of treaties. It's a process that takes place within existing structures. The alliance doesn't have a mechanism to respond to a situation where one of its members gradually expands its influence over another member's territory without a formal breaking point. Outwardly, everything works, but internally, the balance is shifting. From this perspective, silent expansion is dangerous precisely because it doesn't require force. It doesn't trigger an immediate crisis. It doesn't activate defensive reflexes. And it doesn't give the other members of the alliance a clear moment when they would have to say no. All it needs is time, an imbalance of power, and a system that was designed to deal with open conflicts, not with the silent shifting of control. And if this scenario happens once, it becomes a precedent that can be referred to. The second scenario. Silent expansion subtly changes reality through security, while the economic trap changes reality through dependence. This scenario doesn't initially involve soldiers or bases. It works with money, infrastructure, and decisions that look rational on paper. Greenland is a territory with huge ambitions, but at the same time with very limited possibilities. It has a strategic location, potential mineral wealth, and a political desire for greater independence. But at the same time, it suffers from a chronic lack of capital, infrastructure, and workforce. At this point, economic influence is more effective than any pressure. In practice, this scenario would begin with an offer, not a demand. Investments in ports, airports, energy, and logistics hubs. Cooperation in mapping mineral resources, building processing capacities, and securing export routes. Each of these steps could be presented as support for development, economic diversification, and an opportunity for the local population. Each would be formally voluntary. The issue isn't with individual projects, but with their cumulative effect. Mineral mining in Greenland is slow and difficult. It requires years of exploration, demanding infrastructure, complicated permitting processes, and technologically complex processing of raw materials. But that's exactly why it creates long-term relationships. Whoever finances the exploration, builds the roads, ports, and energy sources, gains influence over the pace, direction, and priorities of the entire project. And since most of the crucial investments would come from outside, naturally the weight of decision-making would also shift. The economic trap works when interests start to overlap. Local political elites need growth, jobs, employment, and income. Investors require stability, legal assurances, and long-term contracts. Gradually, a system emerges in which political decisions are made with regard to what is economically sustainable, not what is geopolitically neutral. Formally, sovereignty remains unchanged, but real decision-making space is shrinking under external pressure. This makes the scenario even harder to understand than silent expansion. It's about economic partnership and cooperation, not security measures. It's focused on investment agreements, not troop movements. The alliance does not have the mandate or the tools to intervene in the economic decisions of member states or autonomous territories. And that's exactly why the economic trap is so effective. It doesn't need the alliance's approval, it doesn't trigger emergency meetings, and it doesn't activate any defense mechanisms. However, a new dependency eventually develops. Decisions about infrastructure, energy, and exports begin to determine which political options are still realistic. If a dispute were to arise in such a situation between the economic partner and the formal political framework, the pressure would not act as an ultimatum, but as a fact. Projects may slow, funding suspended, and logistics redirected, all without a single threat. The economic trap is therefore extremely dangerous because it creates a sense of choice where the space for choice is gradually shrinking. Outwardly, it looks like development. At that point, it's called cooperation. But inside, a reality is created in which decisions are made in the shadow of investments, not in the shadow of contracts. And if such a model proves to be functional, it becomes another precedent, not a forceful one, but a systemic one. And those are the hardest to reverse. Previously, these processes took time. Now imagine if time didn't exist. The third scenario, security crisis. While the first two scenarios work with time, safety, and a gradual shift of reality, the third scenario changes the pace. It doesn't create pressure slowly. It creates a situation where decisions have to be made quickly. A security crisis is the moment when long-term tension in the Arctic turns into a specific event that can no longer be ignored or postponed. It doesn't have to be a war or an open conflict. All it takes is an incident that changes the perception of risk. Such a crisis can take many forms. Increased activity of Russian or Chinese ships near Arctic routes, violation of airspace, an incident involving underwater infrastructure, or a cyber attack on systems related to defense and logistics. Each of these moments can be presented as an isolated event. Together, however, they create a picture of growing uncertainty in which the argument of security becomes superior to everything else. In such an environment, Gronsko gains new significance, not as a political matter, but as an operational space. If there were a security escalation in the Arctic, the United States could argue for the need for rapid and centralized decision-making. Temporary measures could be justified as a necessary response to the crisis. Strengthening presence, expanding authority, taking control over key infrastructure points, aiming to stabilize the situation. The key word in this scenario is temporary. Security crises always create room for exceptional solutions that wouldn't pass during peaceful times. The problem is that exceptional solutions tend to persist even after the immediate threat disappears. A crisis legitimizes actions that would otherwise face resistance or serious debate. Under its shadow, control shifts without formal changes, making this scenario especially sensitive for us. A security crisis would need coordination, but also reveal capability imbalances. Whoever has the capacity to act immediately gains a natural advantage. Other partners find themselves in the position of responders, not those who set the direction. And this is where the tension arises between collective decision-making and the reality of power. From a formal point of view, the alliance would still function. There would be consultations, statements, meetings. In practice, however, key steps would be taken in the name of urgency. Security logic would drown out political caution. And once a precedent is set that decisions are centralized in a crisis, it's very hard to return to slower collective mechanisms. A security crisis is therefore a bridge between quiet scenarios and open pressure. It doesn't need direct threats, it relies on fear and uncertainty. On the surface, it's a response to outside events. Inside, however, it changes the balance of decision-making. And that's exactly why it belongs among the most dangerous scenarios. Not because it starts a conflict, but because it makes it unnecessary. Fourth scenario, political bypass. The fourth scenario doesn't rely on silence or crisis. It relies on politics. Specifically, it relies on the fact that Greenland is not a typical country, but an autonomous territory with its own government, its own ambitions, and a long-standing debate about its future. It is precisely this ambiguity that creates room for bypassing official channels. Instead of putting pressure on Copenhagen, the focus shifts directly to Nuuk, not confrontationally, but as partners. In this scenario, there is talk of direct dialogue, of respecting the space, security needs, and the right to decide one's own future. There are offers of cooperation, security guarantees, and economic support, which are addressed directly to the Greenlandic political representatives. This is formal communication with self-government. In fact, however, a parallel diplomatic line is being created, which weakens the role of Copenhagen as a mediator and guarantor of foreign policy. A political bypass works when it creates the feeling that decisions are not being made over the heads of local actors, but in their favor. The argument of self-determination carries great weight in this environment. Greenland has its own identity, language, and historical experience, and part of the political scene has long been talking about greater independence. If a strong external partner enters this discourse, offering support and recognition, it creates a dynamic that is very difficult to control from the outside. From an international law perspective, this would be a highly sensitive process, operating at the edge of its formal boundaries. It would not be annexation or a direct violation of sovereignty, but rather the strengthening of political influence through agreements, memoranda, and informal commitments. Every single step could be justified as legitimate. Problems only occur when they're combined, making this scenario especially troubling for NATO. The alliance is based on states, not autonomous territories. It doesn't have a mechanism to deal with situations where crucial political ties are shifting outside the main state framework. If CODAN found itself in a position where its foreign policy authority was being bypassed, it would still formally bear responsibility, but in reality, it would be losing control over the process. A political bypass is dangerous because it uses legitimacy instead of force. It presents cooperation, not coercion, making resistance harder to mobilize. If such a model proved to be functional, it would create a precedent that could be applied elsewhere, not only in Greenland, but in any environment where there is tension between the central government and autonomy. Ultimately, it wouldn't be a single decision or a dramatic turning point. It would be a gradual redirection of political loyalty. And when loyalty shifts, legal frameworks usually just follow. That's why a political bypass is one of the most effective scenarios for achieving fundamental change without having to openly name it. Fifth scenario, the hard variant. The last scenario is the one that changes the behavior of all the other actors in the background. It's neither the first choice nor the most likely outcome. However, it remains an option that can't be fully ruled out. The hard variant doesn't rely on gradual influence shifts or economic or political workarounds. It is based on open pressure, which does not rely on a long-term process, but on an immediate effect. In this scenario, the United States would shift from discussing alternatives to discussing necessity. The security situation would be interpreted as so serious that it requires quick and unilateral actions. It could involve an ultimatum with time-limited demands or unilateral actions justified by the protection of strategic interests. It wouldn't be a full military operation, but a show of willingness to use force if the goal isn't met. This is exactly where the system's greatest weakness becomes apparent. It doesn't have a clear mechanism for responding to strong pressure from one of its own members. The alliance is built on the assumption of cooperation and consensus. If one of the members chooses to act unilaterally, the others find themselves in a dilemma. Open resistance would mean confronting the alliance's strongest member. However, passivity would mean silent consent in the creation of a precedent. The hard option is dangerous, not because it would automatically lead to a military conflict, but because it would force other partners to act under the pressure of time and a power imbalance. Decisions would not be made based on rules, but on the calculation of costs. What is the lesser risk, an open conflict or backing down? This kind of thinking is ultimately harmful to the alliance. Even if such a scenario never fully materializes, its very existence affects all previous steps. Silent expansion, economic traps, and political bypasses work better when there is an awareness in the background that, in an extreme case, a tougher approach may come. The hard variant is therefore less of a plan and more of a shadow that is cast over all other scenarios. If any of these scenarios seem exaggerated to you, now is a good time to ask yourself why. What will it do to NATO and the West? When we consider these scenarios together, they reveal a range of possibilities, each with its own pace, appearance, and risk level. However, they share a common consequence. All of them test the boundaries of a system that was designed to deal with conflicts between the alliance and the outside world, not to handle internal pressure from the most powerful actors. If any of these scenarios were to progress far enough, NATO would find itself in a situation where it would formally exist, but in practice, it would function differently than it has until now. Smaller states would start reconsidering to what extent they can rely on collective mechanisms and to what extent they need to think about their own safeguards. Larger states would realize that the rules only apply as long as everyone considers them binding. In this case, the West wouldn't face crisis from just one decision or event. It would be a gradual breakdown of trust, a shift from a rules-based system to a system based on power and influence. This shift isn't immediately visible. It's only clear in hindsight, when a precedent turns into the norm. In this story, Greenland isn't the target, but the tool. It is not a problem in itself, but a place where the limits of the reality of power within the alliance can be tested. And that's exactly why this topic is more important than it might seem at first glance. It's not just about one island, but about how the way decisions are made in the international system is changing. If the rules can't be enforced within their own system, it's hard for them to be convincing on the outside. And that's the question Greenland is raising today. Not loudly, not dramatically, but very persistently.
If you liked the video, I'd appreciate a like and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next ones I'm working on. You can support my work through a tip. And if you want to help the video reach more people, click on share. I appreciate it.